Hello, I'm Marianne Schweitzer, and this is my first ever TED Talk. Today we'll be discussing wartime education. It is critical to understand the importance of education in all its eras. It helps us understand in the present of how we got here today. Now, before we begin, let us read the central question. How was education affected by two world-changing wars? And how did the knowledge from the First World War affect times of peace and affect how Americans came into the Second World War? The eras of time that we'll be studying is from 1914 to 1946. This includes World War I, the 1920s, the Great Depression, and World War II. To begin, we need some context on World War I. Many Americans saw no desire to join the European fight, as it was really one ally protecting the other. President Woodrow Wilson saw it was important that America was involved and helped win the Allies. America officially joined the war in 1917, and it was brutal. Trench hole warfare, chemical warfare, and cruel human acts were inflicted on both sides. Many lost their lives, and it was a devastating loss of life. Woodrow Wilson promised 14 points of peace in 1918 in order to end the war. Now, these 14 points were very helpful within other countries, such as India, when they decided to break free from British rule. However, the U.S. was still against the war by the end of it. Now, there were many signs or omens, so to speak, that proved that America shouldn't have been in the war in the first place. Examples of this include the 1919 Black Sox scandal, the Spanish influenza, and many other omens. Now, getting on to education, educational context, and my first primary source, let me explain some general things about how students were taught during World War I. This was during and a little bit after the Progressive Era, where most children in the U.S. were allowed to get an education, and subjects were being more intently taught. According to the Committee of 10, the goal of schools was to create a more inspirational character within each student. There was also an emphasis on secondary subjects to be taught. Now, in the cardinal principles, they expressed a bigger emphasis on elementary learning. Now, getting on to the first source, it was called The Little American Promise, and it was an oath/nursery rhyme that helped children promise not to waste food, as in World War I, it was very critical to have food conservation. Now, this was a huge effort by the U.S. government and the educational systems to get all children of all ages to participate in the war effort. So it also expresses how much patriotism we are trying to spread onto each student of all ages. However, not all students were ready to be explained or be told what war was. So this was a safe and easy way to do it. Now, knowing all of this, you can see that the war was involved in all areas of life, even in such young ages. But was it beneficial? According to the U.S., it wasn't beneficial, and there was still no business that we had participating in World War I. Many people were angry, and this anger continued on to World War II, which we will get back to that. Now, what we learned here was that education was changed in a little ways to support the war in any way possible, especially to those who couldn't be drafted yet. Now, after the war came on the 1920s. Oh, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. I already explained that. My bad. Now, after the war, we come on to the 1920s. This was a new era of America, new era of Americans. There were flappers, new eras for women, prohibition, new eras for alcoholics, and there was a great way to spend some money before the Great Depression. So with all of this going on, why did I choose to focus on a Native American school schedule? Next slide, please. I chose to pick this as my secondary source because there's a great theme of our history focusing on Native Americans being forced into assimilation to our culture. And we still see that pattern today, or at least in 1914. So, despite being a new era of peace and excitement for Americans, it wasn't the same for all people. We still see this wave of oppression and struggle for this new wave of America. So, this schedule that I will be discussing is from 1923 to 1924. And in comparing it to a white schedule, or a white children's schedule, it's actually not that different. The only difference I found was there were a little bit more religious classes given to the Native American students, which continues on to the forced assimilation theme. So, what do we take away from this? Why focus on the 1920s when the next war was still 20 years away? Why did I choose to focus on the 1920s and the 30s? I chose to do this because these were small eras of peace before another devastating war hit the world. What happened to education that we are now in peace? The answer is it changed minimally. And if Americans learned anything, is that we knew how to win a war. And we were going to show that off. Without joining the League of Nations, of course. The Senate disapproved of that. However, we chose to celebrate it anyway. And we chose to celebrate it by spending as much money as we possibly could when barely any of us had it. And that sure came back to bite us pretty hard in 1929. However, we learned that this continued era of peace and oppression was a lifestyle that was sadly expected during this time. Next slide, please. Now, we're going to take a brief pause here and discuss the Great Depression. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed and many Americans suffered. This included children and schools. And we come back to this theme that only rich, white, elite children could go to school, as most other children couldn't afford to anymore, couldn't risk going out and spending money, or were segregated from going to these privileged schools. Now, we also see that in immigrant children, they were forced to divide their work and their school. Immigrant children only went to school maybe once or twice a week in order to compensate. Now, I wanted to bring this up because it's important to discuss this major struggle, especially today, and seeing that major struggle can be overcome together and united. Now, on to the rise of that struggle. President Franklin D. Roosevelt began to dig us out of the Great Depression when World War II began in Europe. However, that anger and distrust for World War I came into play here, and that's why the U.S. wasn't involved for the first few years of the war. I say not involved in quotations because as much as we were a neutral country, we were not. We cut off rubber and oil trades to Japan, we cut off weapon trades with Germany, and we continued to give the Allies support and weapons. And Japan wasn't very happy with us. So, in retaliation, on December 7th in 1941, they attacked us. And they attacked Pearl Harbor with an airstrike. Many lives were lost, and now Americans were united in one common cause, in one common anger. Men were sent overseas, women began to work, and immigrants too. And children were saving tin, saving food, and even buying war bonds. Now, in my third primary source, we see a series of first graders from Miss Mary O'Dawn's first grade class in New York buying war bonds. So we can clearly see that in both world wars, there was a great effect on education, and it was a great effect on all areas of life. But however, we see in World War II there's a greater effort in order to win this war. And that was not only because of revenge, because of the cruelties being performed to the Holocaust victims. Now, next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. I'm a little behind. Why am I a little behind? I'm so sorry. Next slide, please. Thank you. I've already been through this. So, how are schools affected by these life-changing wars? Schools were changed forever as the world finally learned of its horrors that we can commit amongst each other and how that we can be quite uncivil being such a first world privileged country. We also learned that students have a place in the war, whether that's being drafted right out of high school, whether that's buying a war bond, or going out and even saving some tin. And we also learned that peace can be achieved, and that peace can be kept, as long as we're willing to keep it. War is a scary and dangerous time, and I can't imagine being a student during either of them. However, there were ways to support, and we kept that through history. Students have voices, and we can use them. Even today, we learn that students can get involved in their societies and make a difference. Thank you.